I remember waking up that morning with a feeling that the world itself had conspired to paint the day in my favor. The curtains of my room were swaying lightly with the breeze, the sunlight seeping in with a golden glow, almost as if even nature wanted to remind me that it was a day of promise, a day where all the doubts and sacrifices of my past would finally make sense. The house was already buzzing with preparations, makeup artists and hairstylists rushing around, bridesmaids checking flowers, photographers adjusting their cameras. And yet, in the middle of all the chaos, I felt oddly calm. I had convinced myself that this was the turning point, that no matter what storms had tried to unsettle me before, today I would be standing in front of everyone, sealing a future that I had once thought impossible to secure. I sat in front of the mirror, watching the reflection of the woman I had become. Layers of white lace and satin enveloped me, but what struck me more than the dress was the way my eyes seemed different. They carried the weight of years of devotion to a man I thought I knew better than anyone else. In that reflection, I also saw the sacrifices, late nights waiting for him to come home, the dreams put on hold so his could move forward, the quiet reassurances I gave myself whenever his excuses felt a little too rehearsed. But I silenced those thoughts, because today was not the day to recall shadows. Today was supposed to be pure light. The guests were already arriving, I was told. Friends and family had filled the pews, each seat holding someone who had watched us build what they believed was love. The whispers of anticipation, the sound of music starting to rise in the background, the delicate perfume of flowers placed carefully along the aisle. All of it was designed to tell a story of unity. I could hear laughter outside the bridal suite, glasses clinking as people toasted to the life they assumed was about to begin for us. In those fleeting moments before I was to walk down the aisle, I felt suspended between two worlds, the one where I was still the bride, full of expectation, and the one where in a matter of minutes, everything I believed in could unravel. But at that time, I had no reason to suspect the storm brewing quietly behind the ornate walls of the venue. My heart beat in rhythm with the music I knew would soon guide me forward. I thought about how he would look standing there, waiting for me. I imagined his face softening when he saw me approach, his eyes holding that flicker of admiration that had first drawn me to him. I thought about the vows we had written, how mine spoke of resilience, of choosing each other every day even when it was hard. I thought about how the culmination of all those words, all those years, would finally be witnessed by everyone we cared about. As the coordinator came in to tell me it was time, I stood, my dress trailing behind me like a promise etched into fabric. I breathed in deeply, steadying myself for the walk that was meant to mark the beginning of a new chapter. Every detail had been rehearsed, every step aligned, and yet I found my palms damp, my throat dry. Perhaps it was nerves, or perhaps it was a premonition that somewhere in the background, something had already begun to fracture. I didn't know then that the same aisle that had been decorated as a symbol of union would instead become the stage of my first act of survival. I took my father's arm, and the doors opened. The faces turned toward me, a collective gasp rising as they saw the dress, the veil, the image of a woman who had prepared her whole life for this one instant. Cameras clicked, children whispered, mothers dabbed tears from their eyes. I felt the weight of every gaze, but my eyes were fixed only on the end of the aisle, on the man I expected to be standing there. He was there, or so it seemed. His posture was straight, his suit impeccable, and yet, even from that distance, something in the way he shifted on his feet sent a shiver down my spine. It was so subtle that no one else would have noticed, but I did. Perhaps because I knew him too well, or perhaps because deep down, my body had already started to sense what my mind refused to acknowledge. Still, I walked forward, step by step, convincing myself that this unease was nothing more than nerves. The music soared, the petals beneath my shoes crushed softly under my weight, and I smiled through the veil, determined to carry the moment with grace. Every person in that room thought they were watching the unfolding of a perfect love story, but what they didn't know, and what I was yet to fully realize, was that this day would be remembered for something entirely different. It would not be the happiest day of my life, but the day where the mask of love was ripped away, and I would be forced to choose between collapsing under humiliation or rising from it stronger than ever before. The closer I got to the altar, the heavier the silence felt around him. It wasn't the silence of awe or respect. It was the silence of hesitation, of someone carrying a secret too heavy to conceal. I told myself not to imagine things, not to create doubts in a moment that should be untouchable. But the truth was there, pressing against me like a weight in the air. I smiled anyway, because I had been trained by years of compromise to smile through discomfort. What I didn't know then was that the very act of holding my head high at that moment would be the first spark of the strength I'd need for what was about to happen. When I finally reached the altar and looked at him closely, I thought I saw a flicker of conflict in his eyes, a shadow that betrayed the perfect picture painted for everyone else. Still, I stood there, my hand extended, my heart beating with the naive certainty that nothing could destroy this moment. I was wrong. What stood before me was not the man I thought I was marrying, but the shell of someone who had already made a choice that would shatter the illusion I had built my life upon. And yet, in that instant before everything came undone, I held on to the fragile belief that love would win over weakness. That belief, as I would soon discover, was the final lie I allowed myself to live. As I stood at the altar, veil lightly framing my face and the scent of lilies rising from the arrangements around me, I should have felt the culmination of everything I had ever invested into this relationship. Yet even before I walked into that hall, before the doors opened and eyes turned toward me, there had been a moment that had carved itself into my memory with the sharpness of a blade, a whisper that slid past the bustle of voices and clinking glasses, one that didn't belong to the chorus of celebration, but to the undercurrent of doubt I had never wanted to entertain. It came just minutes before the procession began, when I lingered in the bridal room, pretending to sip from a glass of water, while my bridesmaids fluttered around adjusting veils and checking their phones for selfies. Through the door, muffled but distinct, I caught the hurried voice of one of his groomsmen. I could not hear every word, but the fragments that seeped through were enough to still the air in my lungs. "She's here," she said. "He has to decide. Now." The sentence struck me like ice water poured along my spine. I felt the glass tremble in my hand, as if the room itself had tilted. I told myself I must have misheard, that nerves were transforming ordinary chatter into threats. But the tone had not been casual. It had been urgent, insistent, almost panicked. One of my bridesmaids noticed the way my knuckles whitened around the stem of the glass and asked if I was all right, and I smiled with a practiced ease that did not betray the storm gathering behind my eyes. Inside, however, the words repeated themselves endlessly, echoing until they became indistinguishable from the pounding of my heart. "She's here." Who was she? The answer slithered into my mind before I could push it away. The face of the woman I had chosen not to confront despite the subtle signs I had collected over the months. The unexplained late nights. The faint perfume that wasn't mine. The text that disappeared as soon as I entered a room. I had convinced myself that my imagination was cruel, that suspicion was poison that would only destroy what I had built. But now, on the very morning that was meant to consecrate our bond, the shadow of her name lingered like smoke. It was absurd to think she might be anywhere near the ceremony, let alone bold enough to impose herself into his choices. And yet, what else could that whisper have meant? The walls of the bridal suite suddenly felt suffocating. My dress weighed on me like armor forged not for love but for battle. Still, I said nothing. I adjusted the veil, allowed the stylist to fuss with my hair, and kept my face serene. If there was one thing I had learned throughout our years together, it was how to hide my own tremors so that he could shine unchallenged. But this time, it was not for him. It was for me. I would not give the world the satisfaction of seeing me unravel before the story had even reached its climax. When the coordinator signaled that it was time to take my father's arm, I forced myself to breathe evenly. The whispers still pulsed in my head, but I buried them under layers of composure. The doors opened, the aisle stretched out before me, and all eyes fastened onto the illusion of a woman about to step into the life she deserved. They did not know that beneath the satin and lace, I was already bracing myself for something far colder than wedding day nerves. Each step forward was heavier, not because of the train of the dress, but because of the weight of suspicion pressing against my chest. I remembered the voice, the urgency, the phrase, He has to decide now. And though I tried to banish it, I could not silence the possibility that my fate was being negotiated even as I walked toward him. I searched his face as I approached, desperate for reassurance, for the smallest sign that the foundation beneath us was intact. Instead, what I found was a stiffness around his mouth, a flicker in his eyes that told me he was not fully present in that moment. He looked like a man rehearsing lines in his head, distracted by a script no one else could see. The guests interpreted it as nerves, the solemnity of a groom about to bind himself to his bride, but I recognized it for what it was: hesitation. I had seen that expression before, in quieter moments when I asked him questions he never truly answered, when silence stretched too long after my words and his mind seemed elsewhere. I had excused it then. Now, with the echo of that whisper still vibrating in my skull, I could not. I wanted to reach for his hand, to force that connection and ground us in reality, but I held back. There was dignity in restraint, and though doubt chewed at the edges of my composure, I refused to let anyone see it. The priest began speaking, the words a blur of ritual and blessing, but my attention was narrowed to the subtle tension radiating from the man beside me. I could almost hear the conversation that must have taken place before the ceremony, could imagine her voice sharp and demanding, his pleas fumbling, his loyalty tugged between two worlds. My stomach churned, not with sadness, but with something harsher, a cold fury that was already taking root. If he had been given an ultimatum, if she had dared to intrude on this sacred day, then every smile I had forced, every sacrifice I had made, was not only betrayed, but mocked. The ceremony moved forward in appearances only. Guests smiled, music floated, and yet beneath it all, a current of dread ran through me. My blood had frozen in that bridal suite with the whisper, and it had not thawed since. I kept my chin lifted, my voice steady when I responded to the formalities, but inside I was already beginning to construct the walls I would need to protect myself. I realized then that this day, which should have crowned years of devotion, might instead expose the cruelest truth, that I was not the only one standing at this altar. Somewhere, even if invisible, she was here too, pulling strings, forcing choices, daring to dismantle everything in the one place she knew I could not run from the eyes of others. By the time I finished reciting the first lines of my vows, I understood with a clarity that was both devastating and strangely empowering. Something was already broken, and whether it snapped apart in silence or shattered in public spectacle, I would not be spared the humiliation. The whisper had given me warning, a blade of truth disguised as rumor, and while it had frozen my blood, it had also awakened a part of me I hadn't fully realized was there. I would not beg. I would not crumble. If he had been forced to choose, then I too had a choice: to suffer as the abandoned bride, or to rise from the ruins with a resolve no ultimatum could ever strip from me. The truth did not arrive in a scream, nor in some dramatic interruption as the movies so often portray. It revealed itself in fragments, in the way his hands trembled when they should have been steady, in the way his eyes flicked toward the back of the room as if searching for someone who did not belong there, in the suffocating silence that seemed to thicken between us even as the ceremony proceeded. And then it was no longer a matter of suspicion, no longer the echo of a half-heard whisper, but something undeniable, for I caught the glimmer of her face just beyond the sea of guests. She was not hiding in shadows. She had placed herself where he could see her, where I could see her, where every vow spoken would be measured against the weight of her presence. My chest tightened as I recognized her, the woman whose name I had long refused to speak aloud, the shadow that had followed us for months, now standing there with defiance in her posture, as though she were the rightful one, and I the intruder. It was not simply her audacity to come, but the calmness in her gaze, a serenity that told me she had already spoken to him, had already driven a knife into the fragile fabric of our day. I understood then what the groomsman's whisper had meant. She had given him a choice, a merciless ultimatum: choose me, or choose her. The cruelty of it was not in the demand itself, but in the timing, in the way she had engineered the moment so that whichever path he took, destruction would follow. If he chose me, he risked her fury, her secrets, perhaps even exposure of truths I had not yet unearthed. If he chose her, he condemned me to humiliation in front of every person we both knew. And so he stood there, pale beneath the flawless cut of his suit, rehearsing his betrayal behind a facade of ceremony. I felt my body stiffen, though I forced my face to remain composed. The guests smiled, blissfully unaware of the silent war playing out before them. But inside, I was cataloging every detail. The twitch at the corner of his mouth, the bead of sweat sliding down his temple despite the coolness of the church, the way his lips parted as if to speak, yet no words came. He was a man caught between two fires, and rather than extinguish them with truth, he had allowed both to burn until they threatened to consume me as well. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but instead I remained motionless, because dignity had always been my weapon. If I was to be destroyed, it would not be with my own voice breaking the silence. It would be his weakness alone that betrayed me. The priest continued, speaking of love, of fidelity, of the sanctity of union, words that now rang like bitter ironies in my ears. Each phrase was a reminder of the ultimatum, standing like a specter between us. I remembered the years I had poured into him, the sacrifices stitched into every seam of the dress I wore, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the sting of injustice so sharp it stole the air from my lungs. But intertwined with the pain was something else, something darker and steadier. The recognition that if this was the day he chose to abandon me, then it would also be the day I stopped being afraid of what my silence might cost. When the time came for him to speak his vows, his voice faltered. He began, then paused, his eyes again flicking toward her in the crowd. A ripple moved through the guests, confusion too faint to bloom into chaos but strong enough to shift the air. I followed his gaze and found her smiling faintly, a smile that was both a threat and a triumph, as if she already knew the outcome. My blood turned cold, but my mind sharpened. This was no longer just a betrayal. It was a performance, staged at my expense, and I refused to play the role of victim they had written for me. In that long pause, in that unbearable suspension of breath, I understood that his choice had already been made before I even walked through those doors. He had surrendered to her ultimatum, not in that instant, but in the days leading up to this one, when he allowed her presence to grow unchecked, when he fed her power with his silence. Today was merely the stage where the truth would be unveiled, where I would be left to either collapse under the humiliation or craft my own ending from the ruins. The knowledge settled in me with a strange calmness. The world could fracture here and now, but I would not. As the ceremony dragged on, every second stretched into an eternity of revelation. I realized that she had not come here just to win him, but to watch me lose, to feed on the spectacle of my undoing. Her ultimatum was never about him choosing her with love. It was about him choosing her through fear, and in that twisted dynamic lay the true insult. He was not abandoning me for passion, for some irrefutable pull of the heart, but because he was too weak to defy the claws she had sunk into him. That realization was more devastating than the betrayal itself, because it revealed the hollow nature of what I had once believed unbreakable. Yet in the hollowness, something new began to stir. If she believed that her ultimatum had stripped me of all dignity, she underestimated me. If he thought my silence meant compliance, he misjudged me. I would not fight for a man who cowered at the altar, nor would I crumble beneath the watchful eyes of those who expected to see a broken bride. I would stand, I would endure, and when the moment came, I would show them all that while he bent under the weight of another woman's demands, I carried my own power untouched. And so, the ultimatum hung in the air, invisible yet omnipresent, dictating every pause in his voice, every twitch in his expression, every glance toward the woman who dared to stand in my place. It was meant to reduce me, to make me the casualty of their twisted game. But as I stood there, veil framing a face that betrayed none of the storm within, I knew that her ultimatum had done something else entirely. It had awakened the part of me that no betrayal could destroy. This day, meant to be the happiest of my life, had already been rewritten, but not in the way they believed. Their ultimatum had forced me into a corner, but it was from that corner I would rise, sharper and stronger than either of them ever imagined. The moment that was supposed to bind two lives together became instead a theater of absence, a stage where the lead actor faltered and left me stranded in a silence that rang louder than any vow could. I remember the way the priest's words faltered, how his eyes darted nervously between us as if he sensed what was about to unfold, but could not quite grasp the enormity of it. The air inside the church thickened, every breath a struggle, and in that suffocating pause I felt the collective anticipation of every guest pressing against my back, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to confirm that this day was not spiraling into a disaster no one dared to name aloud. But he did not speak. He hesitated, his lips moving without sound, his hands twitching as if they longed to break free from the ritual that bound them to me. And then, without warning, he stepped back. Not a stumble, not a gesture of nervousness, but a retreat, deliberate and undeniable. The aisle stretched between us like an open wound, and in that retreat, the truth crystallized. He was leaving me, here, now, at the altar. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a sudden storm. The whispering began, a low murmur that swelled as guests craned their necks, their carefully practiced smiles dissolving into shock. Some covered their mouths, others leaned toward one another in disbelief, but all of them kept their eyes fixed on me as though my reaction would define the scandal. I felt the heat rise to my face beneath the veil, not from shame, but from the intensity of so many eyes devouring my humiliation. My father stiffened beside me, his grip tightening on my arm as though he could anchor me in place. But I knew no anchor could hold against the tide of betrayal that had just swept across the altar. The man I had trusted, the man I had chosen above all others, had chosen to leave me standing alone in front of everyone we knew. What struck me most was not his absence, but his cowardice. He did not declare his decision with words, did not muster the honesty to say aloud what he had already decided in his heart. Instead, he allowed the silence to speak for him, a silence punctuated by the murmurs of disbelief and the faint rustle of silk as the guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And in that silence, I felt the weight of humiliation settle upon me like a shroud, a humiliation engineered not only by him, but by the woman who watched smugly from the crowd, her presence like a dagger pressed against my spine. She had forced the choice, and he had chosen, leaving me to absorb the spectacle of his weakness. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw a man unraveling. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering between me and her as though he were a boy caught in a lie, rather than a man standing at the threshold of marriage. He could not even meet my gaze fully, could not stand in the ruin he had created. That realization cut deeper than the abandonment itself. He had not only betrayed me, but had also denied me the dignity of closure. He had turned me into an exhibit, a living cautionary tale of a bride left waiting, while he slipped into the safety of indecision and escape. The humiliation was sharp, but it was not the kind that breaks. It was the kind that hardens. I felt my spine straighten, my shoulders square beneath the heavy veil. If he believed that leaving me at the altar would destroy me, he had miscalculated. Yes, the eyes of the crowd burned into me, their pity almost as unbearable as their shock. But beneath their stares I found a flicker of strength. I would not collapse. Not here, not now, not in front of them. If this was the role he had cast me in, I would rewrite the script. I would transform the silence into armor, the humiliation into fuel. Still, the pain was undeniable. Every memory we had shared, every plan we had made, felt like shards cutting into me with each second that passed. I thought of the nights spent waiting for him to come home, of the dreams I had postponed for the sake of his ambitions, of the trust I had defended even when whispers of betrayal had reached me before. All of it had led here, to an altar dressed in flowers and lace, to a day that was supposed to crown years of sacrifice. And he had turned it into a spectacle of abandonment. The injustice burned, but with it came clarity. I was no longer standing at the altar as his bride. I was standing there as myself, stripped of illusion, forced to confront the truth that the man beside me was not worthy of the life I had prepared to share. The priest cleared his throat, his voice faltering as he attempted to salvage the ceremony, but his words fell flat against the chaos. Guests began to murmur louder, some rising from their seats, unsure whether to leave or stay, caught between morbid curiosity and discomfort. My bridesmaids shifted awkwardly, their eyes darting to me for guidance, while his groomsmen stood stiff, their faces pale with the knowledge of what had just transpired. And through it all, She remained in the background, her satisfaction barely concealed, as if my ruin was her triumph. In that moment, humiliation threatened to consume me, but I refused to surrender to it. I let the silence linger, allowed the weight of his absence to settle fully, and then I lifted my chin. If I was to be left at the altar, I would not be left broken. I would be left unbent, unbowed, a woman who could endure even this and emerge stronger. The eyes of the crowd no longer felt like daggers, but like witnesses, and I resolved that one day they would see not the broken bride he had abandoned, but the woman who had risen from the wreckage of his weakness. The altar may have been empty, but I was not. And as he turned his back on me, as the whispers swelled into a roar of disbelief, I understood that while he had humiliated me in front of everyone, he had also set me free. He had shown the world his cowardice, his inability to choose love over fear, and in doing so, he had given me the greatest gift, the chance to become something far greater than the wife of a man too weak to stand beside me. There are moments when words are weapons, sharp and undeniable, and there are moments when silence becomes sharper still, a blade that cuts deeper than any accusation could. As the chaos of whispers rose around me, as guests fumbled with their shock, and my father's grip on my arm tightened with the weight of both anger and pity, I felt the urge to speak, to shout, to demand an explanation that would never come. But something inside me shifted then, something ancient and steady, reminding me that not every wound requires sound to prove its depth. My silence in that moment was not surrender. It was control. It was the one thing he could not take from me. He had taken my trust, my time, my dreams woven into the fabric of this day, but he could not dictate the way I responded to the ruins he had left me standing in. So I stood still, the veil falling like a curtain around me, and I did not speak. I let the silence grow heavy, let it press against the guests until their murmurs faltered, until their pity began to twist into something else, respect, perhaps, or awe at the way I refused to collapse. I could feel his absence like a hollow at my side, could feel the heat of the mistress's gaze from her place in the crowd, but I did not give either of them the satisfaction of watching me unravel. Instead, I breathed, slow and steady, as though I had rehearsed this moment my entire life, as though this humiliation was nothing more than another test I had always known I could endure. My silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of all the years I had given him, with the sacrifices I had made, and the loyalty I had offered unquestioningly. It carried the echoes of late nights waiting for a phone call that never came, of compromises I had swallowed whole because I believed in the greater good of our future, of every doubt I had silenced in myself, so that he might stand taller in the world. All of it lived in that silence, compressed into a force that steadied me when everything else threatened to collapse. And the more I embraced it, the stronger I felt. The whispers of the crowd no longer cut into me like blades. They became a shield, their disbelief a testimony not to my weakness, but to his. I saw it then, in his face as he hovered at the edge of the altar, unsure whether to return or flee entirely. My silence unnerved him. He had expected tears, rage, maybe even a scene that would absolve him by making me appear hysterical or fragile. But when none of that came, when I refused to give the world the spectacle of a bride undone, he began to falter. His lips parted as though he wanted to say my name, but I did not look at him. I fixed my gaze forward, toward the endless aisle I had just walked, toward the doors that promised not escape, but clarity. He was no longer my center. He was a shadow slipping away, and I would not waste my voice trying to hold him in place. The silence spread outward, rippling through the guests, until even the mistress shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had come to watch me break, to see me reduced to nothing so that she might crown herself in the ruins. But my refusal to speak, my refusal to collapse, denied her that triumph. Instead, she became the one exposed, the one who had to sit in the open with her victory hollowed by the sight of a woman who refused to fall. I saw her lips tighten, the smugness slipping from her face as she realized her ultimatum had not produced the spectacle she desired. She had won him, yes, but she had not destroyed me, and that truth unsettled her more than my humiliation ever could have pleased her. The priest, lost in the tangle of protocol, attempted to speak again, to guide us back into ritual. but the words fell like pebbles into a void. The ceremony was already broken, its sanctity shattered by cowardice and betrayal, and no script could restore it. My silence filled the void instead, wrapping itself around me like armor, transforming what should have been my undoing into a moment of power. In that silence, I claimed myself again, not as his bride, not as the victim of her ultimatum, but as a woman who stood unbowed before the collapse of everything she had once trusted. I do not know how long I stood there, unmoving, refusing to give voice to the storm within me. Time itself seemed to stretch, each second an eternity carved into memory. The guests shifted, uncomfortable in their seats, unsure whether to speak or to leave, their gazes bouncing between the empty space at my side and the unbroken stillness of my posture. And then, slowly, I felt something inside me settle, a clarity that came not with tears, but with steel. I had lost him, yes, but in truth he had never truly been mine, not the way I had given myself to him. His absence did not diminish me, it revealed him, and in my silence, I allowed that revelation to hang heavy in the air, undeniable, irreversible. When at last I moved, it was not with collapse, but with purpose. I turned from the altar, each step measured, each breath steady, as though I were walking not away from a life destroyed, but toward a new one waiting to be built. The guests parted in silence, their eyes wide, but I did not look at them. I did not look at him. I walked forward with the weight of silence still wrapped around me, armor forged from betrayal, and I understood then that humiliation could be transformed, that pain could be alchemized into strength if one simply refused to give it voice. He had left me, yes, but I had remained, and in that truth, I found the first spark of the woman I was meant to become. When I left the altar behind, when the hush of scandal trailed me through the doors and the heavy silence of my own dignity settled over the wreckage of vows that had never been spoken, many believed I had walked away defeated. They thought my silence meant I had nothing left to say, that I would retreat into the shadows of shame and lick wounds that might never heal. But they were wrong. What they could not see, what even he and his mistress had failed to imagine, was that I had not come into that church blind. The whispers I had overheard, the doubts I had silenced in the months leading up to this day, the fragments of truth I had pieced together in secret, they had already armed me with more than despair. I had entered the ceremony prepared for two possible endings, one where love triumphed, fragile but intact, and another where betrayal revealed itself fully. And for that second ending, the one they forced upon me, I had already laid the foundation of a plan that would turn their cruelty into their undoing. It had begun quietly, long before the wedding invitations were mailed. Little signs had lingered at the edges of our life together. Text messages answered too quickly. Absences explained with rehearsed precision. The faint scent of perfume that did not belong to me clinging to his shirts when he returned late at night. I had pushed those doubts down, telling myself love demanded trust, but trust does not mean blindness. So I had begun collecting, not accusations, but evidence. Bank statements tucked into a folder when his spending did not align with the excuses he gave. Receipts for dinners and restaurants I had never been invited to. Photographs he claimed were work events, but where a familiar figure stood just far enough in the background to escape notice. I said nothing, asked nothing. I simply observed, recorded, and waited. By the time the day of the wedding arrived, I already knew about her. I knew her name, her address, the hours she kept, even the fact that she too had once worn a ring she claimed bound her to someone else. She was not a fleeting distraction. She was a strategy, a woman who had positioned herself not only in his arms, but in the fragile scaffolding of his ambitions. She offered him flattery where I had offered him truth, temptation where I had offered loyalty, and he, weak as he was, mistook her manipulations for passion. That was his downfall. He thought her ultimatum would leave me blindsided, humiliated into silence. He thought I would crumble at the altar, exposed and empty-handed. What he never realized was that the humiliation had already been woven into my dress, anticipated and accounted for. While he rehearsed betrayal, I rehearsed resilience. While he played with shadows, I gathered light strong enough to reveal them. Walking away from the altar was not an end for me. It was the signal to begin. As I passed through the sea of shocked faces, I did not see pity. I saw witnesses. Every guest who had come to celebrate would one day remember not the bride who cried, but the woman who stood silent and walked away. And when the time was right, those same witnesses would see the truth I carried in my hands. Truth I had gathered meticulously, silently, patiently. My plan was not fueled by rage. It was built from calculation. Rage fades. Humiliation can be buried. But evidence, proof, strategy, these endure, and they wound far deeper than tears ever could. When I reached the bridal suite, still shrouded in lace and dignity, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. The silence that had armored me in front of the crowd gave way to a quieter determination, one that hardened into resolve. I took off the veil, folded it with precision, and placed it on the vanity, as though I were laying to rest the last illusion of innocence between us. Then I opened the folder I had hidden away in my bag, the one filled with all the pieces of his double life. Pages upon pages of evidence stared back at me, a chronicle of deception that would ensure he could never claim ignorance, never twist the story to make me the villain. I ran my fingers over the papers, not with sadness, but with a cold satisfaction. He had thought leaving me at the altar would end the story. In truth, it was only the prologue. I could already envision the steps unfolding. The photographs that would circulate among family and colleagues, the receipts that would raise questions at his office, the quiet conversation I would arrange with the husband of his mistress, who, unbeknownst to her, had already contacted me after finding her lies unraveling. I would not shout. I would not accuse. I would simply reveal. One by one, doors would close around them, not because I slammed them, but because their own choices barred them shut. He would lose not just me, but the reputation he prized, the career he guarded, the social circle he flaunted. She would lose the illusion of being chosen, for the man she had forced to pick her would come to resent her, and the moment of triumph she savored at the altar would turn to ashes in her mouth. My plan was not revenge for the sake of revenge. It was balance restored. It was the quiet certainty that actions bear consequences, that betrayal carries a cost. He had chosen humiliation for me, but I would ensure it returned to him tenfold, not with theatrics, but with precision. And through it all, I would not raise my voice. My silence had already unnerved him more than screams ever could. That silence would carry into every step of the plan, a reminder that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and its whispers are the loudest sound in the room. When I left the church that evening, I did not feel broken. I felt sharpened, like steel forged in fire. The guests would speak of the empty altar, of the humiliation I endured, but in time, their story would change. They would recall the way I carried myself, the way I walked away without a word, and when the truth of his betrayal came to light, they would see that my silence had not been weakness, but strategy. And he would learn that the altar he abandoned was not the place where my story ended, but the place where his downfall began. The church had long emptied when I stepped into the quiet of my own resolve, but the story of what had happened at the altar traveled faster than any messenger could have carried it. By the time evening had fallen, whispers had become accounts, and accounts had become embellished narratives retold in living rooms, in messages, in hurried phone calls between relatives who had witnessed the scene and those who had not. In their eyes, the spectacle was humiliation. In mine, it was foundation. Because humiliation is fleeting when held in silence. But evidence can be orchestrated into revelation, and revelation has the power to bend narratives, to turn shame into triumph. I knew that the day of my wedding was not the day my story ended. It was the day a new act began, and that act demanded an audience larger than any church could hold. I did not wait long to begin. The folder of documents I had carried with me, the photographs, the bank statements, the threads of truth I had quietly collected, these were not weapons to be waved in desperation, but instruments to be played in careful rhythm. I chose the setting with precision. It was not another ceremony, nor a gathering of strangers, but a dinner arranged by his own family only weeks after the disaster, meant to soothe tensions, to reclaim dignity on their terms, to insist the world forget the scandal before it fully burned his name. They invited me, expecting I would decline, expecting I would hide. Instead, I accepted. My silence had unsettled them at the altar. My presence now would shake them further. When I entered the room, heads turned as though a ghost had arrived. They had expected me broken, diminished, but I walked in with the same poise I had carried down the aisle, though now without the weight of lace and veil. My armor was different, steel in my eyes, steadiness in my breath, the quiet certainty that I was not here to explain or to beg but to expose. He was there too, seated uncomfortably at the head of the table, his mistress beside him as though her presence could legitimize his choice, as though flaunting her so publicly would erase the stain of what he had done. But when his eyes met mine, they faltered, and I knew he recognized what she did not, that my silence had never been weakness, that I had not retreated to grieve but to prepare. The dinner began with strained courtesies, his mother offering me small talk heavy with pity, his father shifting uncomfortably in his seat, the clinking of glasses forced and brittle. And then, when the tension had reached its breaking point, I laid the folder on the table. No raised voice, no dramatic declaration, only the soft sound of paper sliding across linen. I opened it, revealing the photographs of him and her long before the altar, the receipts for nights spent together, the texts I had recovered that painted a story of betrayal not as a single moment of weakness, but as a long, orchestrated deception. The room fell into silence, the kind of silence that suffocates, that exposes every hidden truth. Faces paled, hands froze mid-gesture, and all eyes shifted from me to him. He tried to speak, to stammer excuses, but the words choked in his throat. His mistress reached for his hand, but even she faltered when I revealed the final piece, the detail she had not known, that she had not been his only betrayal. I had uncovered traces of others, fragments of a pattern that stretched back further than she imagined, proof that she was not his chosen one, but simply another piece in a cycle of weakness. Her face drained of color as she realized that the ultimatum she had forced had not crowned her but reduced her to a pawn in a game he had been playing long before. I did not shout, did not gloat. I let the evidence speak, let it dismantle the facade they had both tried to construct atop my humiliation. The family who had pitied me now turned their pity to him, their eyes filled not with judgment for me, but with contempt for the man who had orchestrated such disgrace. In that moment the narrative shifted. I was no longer the abandoned bride, no longer the silent victim of betrayal. I was the one who had held her silence until it could be sharpened into truth, the one who had walked into a room full of doubters and left them with no choice but to see me not as broken, but as unbreakable. The fallout was immediate. His parents, once his shield, withdrew their support. Friends who had defended him fell silent. Colleagues who had dismissed rumors began to question his integrity. And the mistress, who had relished her triumph at the altar, now found herself exposed in front of everyone she had hoped to impress, her victory collapsing into dust as the foundation of lies crumbled beneath her feet. They had thought the altar was the climax of the story, but it was here, in this room filled with witnesses who mattered most to him, that the true spectacle unfolded. As I gathered my things and rose to leave, the silence once again followed me, but this time it was not the silence of humiliation. It was the silence of respect, of awe, of recognition that I had not only endured betrayal, but had turned it into a weapon sharper than any vengeance delivered in rage. I did not look back at him as I left. He was already unraveling, his mistress at his side no longer triumphant, but trembling. The plan had been in my hands all along, and tonight it had played out exactly as I had intended. The public turnaround had not been a scene of fury, but of precision. It was not my voice that had destroyed them, but the quiet revelation of truth, laid bare for all to see. And as I walked into the night, the cool air filling my lungs, I understood that I had taken back everything they had tried to strip from me. The altar had been their moment. This, finally, was mine. The night of the dinner marked the turning point, the precise moment when the carefully maintained illusion of their triumph began to rot from within. I had walked away in silence, leaving behind a room stunned into disbelief, a family forced to confront the truth that their son had built his future on deceit, and a mistress who realized that the crown she had demanded was no more than a garland of thorns. Yet the collapse did not happen all at once. It came in waves, subtle at first, then thunderous, each one breaking upon them until there was nothing left but ruin. He tried, in the days that followed, to regain control of the narrative. He called relatives, spun stories of exaggeration, claimed that the documents I had revealed were taken out of context, that the photographs had been misunderstood. But lies cannot hold when truth has already found its voice, and though my lips remained closed, the evidence spoke louder than anything he could muster. People who had once defended him began to avoid him. Colleagues sidestepped his presence, and invitations that had once been plentiful grew scarce. In every circle where he sought refuge, whispers followed, whispers fueled not by my words but by the proof I had left in their hands. His downfall was not dramatic, not theatrical. It was relentless, a slow erosion of every foundation he had once trusted to hold him. The mistress fared no better. At first she clung to him with a desperate bravado, parading herself as though the shame belonged only to me, as though winning him at the altar had made her untouchable. But triumphs built on betrayal have short lifespans, and soon the cracks began to show. She discovered what I had already known, that she was not his first deception, not his only indulgence, not the chosen one she had convinced herself to be. I had left her the proof too, not directly, but in ways that ensured it would find her. Anonymous messages, traces of conversations she had not known existed, little fragments of truth planted where she would stumble upon them. When she confronted him, the arguments were loud enough to reach neighbors' ears, the screaming of accusations layered with his frantic denials. What they had mistaken for passion turned quickly to poison, each of them clawing at the other, trying to salvage pride from a relationship already rotting. The implosion was inevitable. Friends who had once celebrated them began to recoil, unwilling to associate with the spectacle of their fights, unwilling to lend credibility to a union forged in deceit. Families that had tolerated her presence withdrew their support, whispers spreading that she had not won a man but shackled herself to a coward. And beneath it all, the two of them turned inward, their relationship becoming the very battlefield they had once plotted to wage against me. I did not need to raise a hand or voice. Their lies consumed them from the inside, each argument a reminder that they had built their lives on the ruins of someone else's pain. I watched from a distance, not with glee, but with a detached clarity. Their fall was not a spectacle I orchestrated, not a scene I needed to direct. It was the natural consequence of choices they had made, the harvest of seeds they had sown long before I chose silence as my weapon. The more they clawed at one another, the more evident it became that I had been the only one who could have steadied him, the only one who had ever offered truth instead of illusion. But that truth was no longer theirs to claim. They had squandered it, and now they were left with each other's lies. His career faltered next. What began as awkward silences in boardrooms became questions from superiors, became scrutiny of his financial dealings, became suspicion of his professional integrity. The receipts I had gathered, once dismissed as private indiscretions, revealed patterns that bled into his work. He had blurred lines between personal indulgence and professional responsibility, and once those lines were illuminated, there was no turning back. Contracts slipped through his fingers, opportunities vanished, and the colleagues who once admired him grew cold. He was no longer the man who had stood at the altar in an impeccable suit. He was the man whispered about in corridors, the cautionary tale others used as a warning. For her, the fall was more personal. The friends she had once flaunted turned into critics, women who saw in her not a victor but a thief, a woman who had traded her dignity for a moment of false triumph. Invitations stopped arriving, doors closed quietly in her face, and she began to realize that whatever place she had tried to carve for herself in his world was not truly hers. The same family she had sought approval from now looked at her with thinly veiled disdain, whispering behind her back, refusing to accept her as anything more than the reason their son had become a disgrace. The two of them, bound together by betrayal, now found themselves shackled to one another in misery. Each argument peeled away another layer of illusion, until what remained was not love but resentment, not unity but mutual destruction. They had thought the ultimatum had given them power, had thought leaving me at the altar had crowned them with victory. Instead, it had marked the beginning of their fall. And through it all, I remained silent. I did not need to tell the world what they had done. The world saw it unravel on its own. I did not need to humiliate them further. Their own choices ensured humiliation followed them wherever they went. The strength I had found in silence grew only deeper, a reminder that some battles are not won by striking first, but by enduring long enough to let the enemy destroy themselves. Their fall was not my doing, but it was my justice. By the time months had passed, their names no longer carried the weight they once did. He was a man diminished, stripped of reputation, his career in tatters, his future uncertain. She was a woman scorned, trapped in the very relationship she had fought so viciously to claim, discovering too late that she had not stolen a prize but a burden. And I, once the abandoned bride, was no longer defined by them at all. Their fall had freed me, not because I had engineered it, but because they had proven to everyone, and perhaps most importantly to themselves, that betrayal does not build a future. It only ensures collapse. By the time their relationship had begun to collapse in front of those who once believed in their performance, the true weight of consequences started to settle upon them, heavier than either betrayal or humiliation could have warned. What neither of them had foreseen was that leaving me at the altar had not been just a personal betrayal. It had been a public act, witnessed by dozens of people who carried the memory like a shard under the skin, retelling it in whispers that soon became truths no excuse could erase. In that church, in that single moment of cowardice, they had written the first line of their own downfall, and everything that followed was merely the ink filling the rest of the page. His career, already fragile from the exposure of his duplicity, began to fracture under scrutiny. What had once been overlooked as minor indiscretions, dinners passed off as networking, business trips explained away as routine, now carried the stain of suspicion. Colleagues who once sought his approval now questioned his integrity. Clients grew wary, contracts slipped away, and the leadership that had once trusted him quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to stake their reputation on a man revealed as dishonest in his private life and careless with boundaries in his professional one. Reputation, once tarnished, does not easily recover, and he found that no amount of charm could restore what his betrayal had corroded. His emails went unanswered, his calls ignored, and in the silence that followed, he discovered the harshest truth. The world does not forgive men who humiliate others so openly, because the spectacle lingers long after the details fade. For her, the consequences were more insidious, but no less devastating. She had walked into that altar convinced she had won, convinced that forcing his hand had given her the power of choice. But power built on destruction is fragile, and soon even her reflection betrayed her. Friends she had once flaunted no longer wanted to be seen in her company, fearful of being tainted by her infamy. Families whispered about her behind closed doors, branding her not as victorious but as the thief of another woman's future, the woman who had turned joy into tragedy. Invitations to gatherings disappeared, colleagues in her own work began to withdraw, and the glow she had expected to bask in turned cold and judgmental. She had thought herself triumphant, but the world saw her not as chosen, only as complicit. The financial consequences came next, and they struck with the precision of a blow neither had anticipated. In his arrogance, he had never considered how much of his life was intertwined with mine. Accounts where my name lingered, properties purchased with money I had helped secure, documents that bore my careful signature alongside his reckless one. And when I withdrew, when I cut ties and ensured that my contributions were no longer his to spend, the collapse was swift. Loans came due, debts were exposed, and the comfort they had expected to share together dwindled into scarcity. The dinners that once marked their triumph turned into arguments over bills, and the gifts she had once demanded were replaced with excuses and apologies she had never wanted to hear. They had thought betrayal came free. They learned instead that it carried a cost measured not only in reputation, but in survival. Even socially, their implosion carried echoes they could not silence. The family dinners where they had hoped to establish themselves turned cold. His parents, who once pitied me, now pitied themselves, for they realized too late that they had defended a son who had disgraced them. At gatherings, the mistress no longer basked in triumph, but squirmed under the weight of stares that lingered too long, whispers she could not unhear. He avoided old friends. unable to meet the eyes of those who had witnessed his cowardice at the altar, knowing that no amount of denial could erase the image of me standing steady while he faltered. And yet the deepest consequence was not financial, nor social, nor professional. It was personal. For both of them, the lie that had once bound them together became unbearable. The mistress, once so sure of her position, now woke each day with suspicion gnawing at her, questioning whether she too would be discarded when the next temptation appeared. He, once so intoxicated by her ultimatum, began to resent her for the destruction she had helped engineer, seeing in her not the passion he once craved, but the root of his downfall. Their arguments grew sharper, their silences longer, until what once masqueraded as love revealed itself to be nothing more than the debris of choices made in weakness. From my place apart, I did not need to intervene. I watched the consequences unfold, not with vengeance, but with a kind of quiet inevitability, as though the world itself had chosen to balance the scales on my behalf. I had already reclaimed my dignity, already carved out a future beyond them, and now the universe did what it always does when truth is left to breathe. It revealed, it dismantled, it punished. My silence had been my strength, my evidence my shield, but the true executioner of their downfall was their own reflection. They could not escape what they had done, because it followed them into every room, into every conversation, into every sleepless night where regret gnawed louder than pride. They had believed leaving me at the altar would define me forever, that humiliation would cling to me while they walked free into their future. But humiliation, when met with silence and resolve, transforms. It hardened into armor around me, while it seeped into their veins like poison, slow and unstoppable. The real consequences were not mine to bear, they were theirs, and in every loss they suffered, in every door closed to them, in every friend who turned away, I saw not vengeance, but justice. By the time the weight of it all settled fully, they were no longer the couple who had mocked me with their ultimatum. They were broken, diminished, their future nothing more than ashes clutched in desperate hands. And I, the woman they had tried to reduce to silence and shame, was no longer defined by them at all. Their consequences had freed me, because in their ruin, I saw proof of what I had always known. Betrayal carries a price, and they had chosen to pay it in full. In the weeks and months that followed, when the spectacle of betrayal had run its course, and the echoes of humiliation no longer clung to my every breath, I began to see with clarity that the altar he had abandoned was not the grave of my dignity, but the birthplace of something far greater. At first, the silence I carried was heavy, filled with questions I could not yet answer, with the weight of years poured into a man who had proven unworthy of even my memory. But silence, once tempered, becomes discipline, and discipline becomes strength. I learned that I did not need to defend myself against whispers, because the truth had already done that for me. I did not need to chase explanations, because his choices had shouted louder than any words could, and I did not need to define myself by the ruins of that day, because what remained after ruin was not emptiness, but possibility. The altar became a symbol, not of abandonment, but of survival. When people spoke of it, when their eyes softened with pity or widened with curiosity, I let them. I did not correct them, did not protest, because I knew their stories would fade while mine endured. For me, that altar was not the end of a love story, but the beginning of my own story, one no longer tethered to the weakness of a man or the schemes of a woman who had mistaken cruelty for victory. In the solitude that followed, I began to rediscover myself, the woman who had sacrificed too much, who had given away pieces of herself in the hope of building something lasting, who had mistaken loyalty for obligation. That woman had stood silent when he fled, but the silence had not broken her. It had transformed her into someone new, someone who no longer begged to be chosen, but chose herself. I returned to the routines of life slowly, but each step felt different. Work no longer felt like a distraction from love, but a purpose in itself. Friendships that I had neglected while trying to hold together a fractured relationship became lifelines, bonds that reminded me of who I was, beyond the label of fiancé. And family, who had once worried for me, began to look at me with pride instead of pity. They saw that I had not allowed betrayal to define me, but had instead carved it into the foundation of a stronger identity. Even strangers, those who had whispered about the scandal, began to shift their gaze. Where they once saw a woman abandoned, they now saw a woman unbroken, a figure who had endured public ruin and emerged with her head held higher than before. The man who had left me, and the mistress who had demanded her ultimatum, became footnotes in the larger narrative. Their downfall had been swift and relentless, but it was no longer my concern. I did not follow their arguments, did not chase their failures, did not revel in their collapse. Their destruction belonged to them alone, and I owed them nothing more. Not my anger, not my attention, not even my satisfaction. Freedom came not from watching them fall, but from realizing I no longer cared whether they stood at all. Their choices had severed them from my story, and in that severance, I found peace. I often thought back to the moment when the church doors opened, and every eye turned toward me, to the way my heart had swelled with hope, even as unease gnawed at the edges of my composure. I thought of how I had walked that aisle with the belief that my future was waiting at the altar, only to find that the true future awaited me in the strength to walk away. There is a kind of poetry in that reversal, a symmetry in realizing that the path I thought would bind me to another instead delivered me back to myself. I no longer mourned the loss of what could have been, because I understood now that it was never mine to lose. Love built on deceit is not love, and loyalty offered to a coward is not loyalty at all. It is sacrifice wasted. In the years ahead, I knew there would be new beginnings, new bonds, perhaps even new love. But none of it would be built from desperation. None of it would come from silencing my doubts or diminishing my worth. The woman who rose from the empty altar was not the same woman who had once bent herself to fit into the fragile structure of his promises. She was whole, and she was enough. The altar had stripped me bare, but in the bareness, I discovered resilience I had never known, and resilience once found does not fade. When I look back now, I do not see the humiliation they intended for me. I see the moment I became untouchable. They had tried to write my ending in public shame, but instead, they gave me the prologue to a new story, one in which I no longer played the role of victim, but of survivor, strategist, and finally, victor. And though the world may still recall the bride who stood alone in white while the groom fled, I know the truth. I was never left empty at the altar. I was reborn there, clothed not in lace and vows, but in silence, strength, and the unshakable knowledge that I had risen, and that I would never bow again.